Ultimately, all of us here today share a common goal, and that is to improve standards in the private rented sector. We do recognise that there are rogue and criminal elements, and all of us actually do want to improve standards. So there's a lot more common ground that we might at first consider. The private rented sector is very, very fragmented, and that has always been one of the problems in terms of getting people to work together, because there's a lot of different agendas, a lot of difference of opinions, and so on. But really, we do share a lot of common ground. So today, we wanted to bring together many disparate elements of the private rented sector to talk about that and see how we can all work together to make the private rented sector a better place, because ultimately we are all interdependent on each other. If we have no tenants, then landlords haven't got anybody to rent to. If there's no landlords, then lettings agents are going to go out of business. So ultimately, we're all interdependent on each other, and in that case, it is far better that we work together and explore common ground rather than backbiting and doing our own thing. So that is the purpose of today's debate, is to look at where that common ground is. First of all, Karen, if I could come to you. Clearly, in the last 3 years, we've seen a huge amount of government intervention in the private rented sector. The velocity of change has really sped up. What do you put that down to, and what do you think government's agenda is with the private rented sector?
I'm a Labour MP, I'm an opposition member of Parliament and indeed a backbencher, so I'm not here to explain the government's thinking, I'm afraid. Others will have to do that. But I can say that there is some common ground, I think, as Vanessa, you've rightly said on this, which is that the private rented sector has grown dramatically in the last 13 or 14 years. And in particular, it has grown as a home for, particularly for families with children and others who possibly prior to the middle of the last decade were not expecting the private rented sector to be their home. And I think that has generated a particular interest in amongst political parties, amongst whatever the government of the day is, to ensure that the private rented sector is as good a home for those groups of people as possible. Now, we all know, and I'm sure David will reinforce this from RLA research, that the large majority of tenants are satisfied with their private homes, but a substantial minority are not. And that is clearly one of the reasons why the government has brought forward a number of changes, particularly targeted at what they call rogue landlords. And it's one of the reasons also that I brought forward my own private member's bill, which I could just say 1 minute about now as an introduction, which is to close a loophole in the law at the moment in the Landlord and Tenant Act that allows a tenant to take action where their property is in disrepair, but not where it is unfit. And we know, so for example, if a boiler is broken, there is a form of redress. If a heating system is absent entirely or wholly inadequate, leading to chronic problems of damp and mould, for example, there is no action that the tenant can take on their own behalf, and hasn't been for decades since the concept of fitness fell out of law. So I've brought that in as well. We're going into the House of Lords in a couple of weeks' time, which is nearly the end of its legislative journey. And it's another tool to enable that minority of tenants who live in unsatisfactory accommodation to take action. I think probably for further questions, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the role of local authorities in enforcement, so I won't say more about that now. But I'll just end on this point, that some of you will have seen the Select Committee for the Department of Homes, Communities and Local Government report on the private rented sector. If you haven't, it's worth a glance at online. But they say, and I think this is right, that the number of different measures that have been brought forward, some of which are undoubtedly kind of confusing, do need an overview, and they want the Law Commission to do an overview of all of the current legislative arrangements as they pertain to the private rented sector, to try and make sure that they are all fit for purpose and that they all cohere and complement each other.
Thank you. Well, I think the question was what are the government's plans for the private rented sector? I think if you look back at the last 3 years at least, we've seen that who we would think of perhaps as our natural allies in the Conservative Party have turned against the private sector in some considerable strength and force. And I'm not entirely sure that they are finished with us yet. The problem is I believe they are causing phenomenal problems, possibly unforeseen problems, possibly things that they really didn't think were going to happen, but as the next 2 or 3 years unfold, I'm fairly confident in saying that things are going to get a lot worse, not only for us, but for all of the tenants, particularly the people at the bottom of the pile. Now, contrary to popular opinion, I personally don't believe that most landlords are evil, greedy, scum-sucking parasites who are determined to make their lives, the tenants' lives, hell. I think that if landlords are anything like me as a professional, the tenants will be our #1 priority, and they always are for me. Why this is not getting back to government, I don't know. Because the people who are quite senior in government who make these decisions are not actually stupid people. I happen to know for an absolute fact that some of those people know exactly what's going to happen. They understand it, but collectively, for some reason, they are not speaking out against the government machine. The government machine, I believe, is run by a fairly small number of people, particularly within the Treasury, who dictate policy, which the politicians more senior to them actually go, OK, that sounds good, it will probably play well with the electorate, so let's go with that. But sooner or later, we are going to see problems that the government are going to become responsible for. Having said that, I don't think they are finished with us yet. I think their plan, politically at least, because they think it will win votes for them, is to see that private landlords are pushed into recession, pushed into not growing their portfolios, not providing houses for people that need them, and ultimately that is going to be a problem. So where they go from here and what they do next, I don't know. That's in terms of their overall view of the sector. In terms of raising standards, I would fully support Karen Buck's bill. I think standards are so important in the private sector. It's one of my personal bugbears that other landlords do not behave the way that we professionals do. They tar us with their brush, they make their tenants' lives a misery. It's unfair, it's unjust, it's unwarranted, and no professional landlord needs to behave in that fashion. We all provide excellent homes that we should be very proud of, and as long as we can keep that going, then I will be happy to call myself a private landlord. Beyond that, I think it's a mystery, but I think landlords are incredibly nervous at this time, quite justifiably, and I think the next 2 or 3 years are going to be very, very interesting for everybody involved in the sector. Thank you.
A plan? You asked what the government's plan was.
Well, I asked what their agenda was, really.
I don't think they've got one. I don't think they have a plan or an agenda. I think there is a series of uncoordinated efforts to achieve 2 things: money and votes. The Treasury sees, and I've had this said to me by special advisors, landlords as people with money. And the Treasury wants your money. It's that simple. It hasn't got enough money. It's lost it in various exciting ways. Whatever your view may be of our future relationship with Europe, the Treasury sees that as losing their money. They need to replace that money, and they see landlords as being a golden goose from which they can continue to pluck feathers up to a point. No one's quite clear what that point is. They're not clear about what that point is, but at the moment, it's working for them. And I would point immediately to the 3% SDLT uplift, which brought the Treasury 1 billion extra in its first year beyond their projections, and they see that as an easy win. The second area I think it's about is votes. There is a perception in Parliament that tenants vote now. Previously, tenants just didn't vote. They never voted, and where they did, their voting was quite uncoordinated. Generation Rent, prior to 2 elections ago now, just after, so not the most recent snap election, but just after the election before, produced a report suggesting that more and more MPs would be reliant on tenant votes. At the most recent election, there are now a couple of studies going around showing that tenants actually switched vote from the Conservative Party to the Labour Party. That, as a report, has garnered a lot of interest within the current ruling party, because you're mostly talking about urban swing seats. So in practice, the government is quite interested in doing things that will encourage tenants to switch vote back from what they perceive as Labour voting to Conservative voting. The general view is that these switch votes are quite mobile votes. and can be switched back and forth by small policy shifts. The other problem, of course, is that the Housing Act 88 has been around since I had short trousers. So it's actually not changed very much, and successive governments just couldn't be bothered to deal with it. And the current government is reluctant to do what, say, Wales and Scotland have done, which is have a complete rewrite. So it's tinkering at the edges with a number of small changes, like making little changes to Section 21 to make it the most complex system ever known and ever devised. And they will probably continue to do that because all of that plays back to, or at least have consultations on potentially doing it, because it all potentially plays back to attracting what they see as a swing vote at the next election.
So from a day job perspective, Credit Ladder tries to keep a fine balance between keeping both landlords and tenants happy. It's not an easy task. And maybe later on I'll get a chance to explain what we try and do as a business. No, you can't hear me? Can you hear me, guys? Yeah? Okay, I'm going to shout. If it gets too loud, tell me, okay? I'm not going to add anything significant to what's gone before, but what I will say is the shift in people moving from owning their home to renting is significant, and it's forecast to continue. And a lot of the work that we've seen as a business is designed to appeal to the tenant and the tenant's vote moving forward. So at the moment, about 30% of properties in the UK are rented. It's forecast to grow to 35 and 40% over the next 10 years or so. And so as a voter group, tenants are becoming increasingly more important. So I think the point's already been made. I think there is a strong revenue grab in play, and I think it will squeeze and squeeze and squeeze until basically people can't give anymore. But ultimately, short term, I think, is ensuring that tenants see the government working for them to ensure that they get their vote at the next election.
It's interesting there, you said that tenant demand is set to grow, which is obviously good news for landlords, but then if landlords are being deterred from the sector, where are all these tenants going to end up being able to live? Because as we know, there is a significant shortage of social housing, and many councils are already struggling to discharge their housing obligations into the private rented sector. I personally know of one council that's got 736 families on its waiting list. I know of another council that has 1,500 families on their waiting list, and a further council that actually got 3,000 families on their waiting list. I know of in Oxford, where the top 2 floors of a Holiday Inn or similar hotel is actually being used to provide accommodation for families that don't have any other form of housing. They are living in one room with no catering facilities. Clearly, a temporary accommodation, B&B type accommodation, far more expensive to the taxpayer than paying for private landlords' accommodation.
Given that Section 21 is a nightmare now to actually achieve, Section 8 is becoming much more common and much more desirable by solicitors and people like that as being a direct end. Where are those people going? Because they're not entitled to be rehoused. So where are they? Are they on the bottom floor of something? Or what? Where are
This is the point. And I think that does lead nicely on to my next thing, which was generally actually touched on by both Jamie and David. It seems to me, and in fact, I actually got this quote, sorry for name dropping, but I got this quote from Ian Duncan Smith when he was here at one of the previous shows, and we were walking to the auditorium, and he said to me, he said, George Osborne has tweaked too many levers. Now, what does the panel think of that? Because clearly, when the private rented sector is very complex organism, and if you tweak one thing, it has impact somewhere else, and government didn't even do an impact assessment for Section 24. So any panel views on that?
There is a well-worn political theory that basically suggests all governments are a bit like a plate spinner carrying out a world record attempt, and when it's all going swimmingly near the start, all the plates are spinning along, and towards the end, the plate spinner's sprinting back and forth trying to catch the plates and keep them up in the air. And there is an aspect in which governments actually are doing that, because you can't really measure in advance what's going to be the net effect of a change, because the system's too complicated and you can't have a control group. You can't run the same thing twice. So I suspect what will happen is the government will keep running back and forth, and it's sometimes also called the teeter-totter theory of politics, trying to rebalance things. And I suspect the end of the result will be that at some point the government will accept that there is a shortage of property and that they're in danger of losing it, and will then go and produce some other random piece of change to try and rebalance it, which will then have another effect, and then they will go and fix that, and so the scheme rolls on. That is pretty much, I would say, how politics works. Karen might disagree. Well, the problem at the moment is the government doesn't accept that there's a reduction in the private rented sector. The way the government is currently analysing the situation at the moment is that they're looking at the figures of increased mortgages to first-time buyers, and they're saying, therefore, that means that the Section 24 change and the SDLT uplift works. But equally, you could say, actually, it means Help to Buy works, which I suspect is rather more the answer. But of course, Help to Buy also heats the market. So the difficulty is the government is mega wedded to Help to Buy, because it's strongly supported by very, very large interests who, of course, in no way contribute in any way to the government at all, or to any politician, obviously. So they are very, very powerful. They're better. They have more lobbyists than you do. Let's just put it that way. I'm one of a very small number. They have lots. Shouldn't be.
Hello. Oh, yes. Sorry. Well, yeah. I mean, David's put it very well. I can't really add to that. The plate spinning analogy is probably perfect. I mean, what I would have said differently, I think, is that they are just pulling random levers. They've got there feels like there is no long-term plan for housing, and probably hasn't been for 30 or 40 years. So I sense very much that they are saying, quick, there's a problem there. Do something quickly to win some votes and make it look good. So they quickly do something. Oh, no, look, something's happening over there. Quickly, run over there and pull that lever. And what they do is that because there's no coordination, it becomes like this, kind of ridiculous system of just pressing any buttons you can to make anything look better or temporarily work better for the purposes of saying that you've done something about it. But as we've seen, and as probably most of us in this room know, that can't last. You have to have a coherent policy which is workable and which is acceptable to as many people as possible. Not the way they're doing it at the moment, all this knee-jerk reaction. It can't sustain.
Well, you wouldn't expect me to defend the government, and I'm not particularly going to, but I am going to say that there is a whole set of fundamentally competing objectives here that we all have to kind of understand if we're going to find a way out of this. Now, we know that the private rented sector is providing homes for a large and growing number of people. I mean, whether it's dipped in the last year or not, we can look at those figures. But we also know that most people want to be homeowners. And we know that most people, in their aspiration, would rather be paying a mortgage and having their own home than renting. So that is a real political pressure, and part of that political pressure has ended up, I think, completely wrongly in Help to Buy, which, as I don't have the figure in front of me, but I think it's over £10 billion has been spent in Help to Buy, which has indeed also overheated the market. But it is a genuine political pressure. But the other political pressure in all of this, and one of the tensions in government is different government departments trying to minimise their own exposure and responsibilities and piling pressures onto other government departments. And a particularly good example of this, which is very pertinent, I think, to the private rented sector, is what's happened between the Department of Work and Pensions and the housing sector. So since 2010, £35 billion has been taken out of the social security budget, £35 billion. And a lot of that £35 billion has worked its way out through the constraints on the lower income end of the private market and their ability to rent. And at its sharpest end, we see that in universal credit. So we have one government department wanting to cut its exposure, driven very much by George Osborne's cuts, and another government department seeking to ensure that, again, particularly lower income people are able to find somewhere to live. The social rented sector has been contracting, and those people are no longer able to afford to exercise any market control within the private rented sector. And that inevitably ends up with those people with the lowest incomes being trapped in the poorest end of the private rented sector with the least ability to be able to challenge their housing conditions. So yes, too many levers. Yes, the lack of a long-term strategic plan, because we've seen a doubling in rough sleeping and we've seen a 50% increase in the number of homeless households since 2010, but absolutely inevitably a consequence of a set of government decisions which have squeezed people's purchasing power in the private rented sector on the one hand and poured money into home ownership in the other. So, you know, if you only worry about one government department, you will end up with all kinds of unforeseen consequences. And that is bad news, frankly, for good landlords, and it's particularly bad news for tenants.
I was just going to add one thing, which is anyone who runs a business knows that if you change 5 things or you change 7 things, you don't actually know what any of those have delivered, because you change one thing, you try and assess, and then you maybe change a second. So I think it's very clear that there is lots of change that's taking place, and no one really knows exactly the impact it's had. We can all sit here and find a stat that suits our argument. I think that's going to be very easy, right? So there's more people letting, but there's more people buying for the first time. So actually the increase in stamp duty has clearly worked, right? Because more people are buying. So there's an argument, there's a stat. But the reality is very different, because you have short-term impacts, you have long-term impacts. And I think every government, just like businesses typically work to a 1-year cycle if they're a limited business, because they have to deliver in that time frame. Governments typically do not work to long-term strategy. They all work until the next election. And that might be 4 years, it might be 5, but ultimately within that time frame, the last 18 months probably becomes a grab for votes. And right now, the grab for votes, the current government have assumed that the grab for votes is more important from a tenant perspective than it is from a landlord perspective. And unfortunately, that is just the way it is right now.
Has any member of the audience got any comment or question that's been provoked so far? Gentleman there with his hand up.
Hello, I've got a question to Karen about her bill. I had 2 questions really. The first one was, how does it fit in with the existing housing, health and safety 10 points and all that? But I think you probably answered that with the committee. But the main question is blocks of flats. As a landlord, I find I'm dealing with the tenants on the one hand and the managing agent of the block of flats on the other. And so much property is leasehold in London. With your bill, there are a lot of issues where the landlord as a leaseholder cannot solve it because it's waiting on the managing agent and the ground freeholder to solve a problem to do with the lifts, to do with fire escapes, to do with water penetration, things like that. And at the moment, the individual landlord is based, really, it's a goodwill thing, what they can get out of the managing agent. Would a tenant be able to apply directly to a managing agent or a ground landlord to sort out a problem under your scheme? Or is the committee also aware of this issue? I think it's pretty massive in London, to be honest. I hope I'm not alone, but it is massive.
Yeah. So we extended the bill with government cooperation in committee to ensure that a tenant would be able to take action if the fitness pertained to common parts, so not just inside the flat. I'm very aware, I mean, obviously 95% of properties in my constituency are flats, and there are instances, we don't know in terms of Grenfell, but this was clearly an issue where residents in Grenfell were saying before the fire that they believed that the cladding was unfit and had no recourse to be able to pursue that. Now, I don't know whether that will be the outcome, and I'm not making any judgment, but clearly where people may have an argument there, they should be able to pursue it. But if the landlord is unable, after all reasonable efforts have been made, to secure the cooperation of another of an owner of another property in a block of flats, then they would not be liable for that. So they have to take the reasonable steps, but you know, only so far. They would not be liable, obviously, if a problem arises in another property. Although in many cases those problems would be pertaining to repairs, not to fitness, which I think would be more likely to be part of the common parts or interior of a specific property. No, I appreciate you won't, but I'm using that because often people kind of see that as a way of illustrating a particular point. But I'm very happy, you know, I always am. I mean, there's a lot of information on online about the bill and the explanatory notes. But obviously, if individuals would like me to just share that with them, then give me your email and I'll make sure that you do.
Oh, thank you, Karen. One of the things that we mentioned earlier was that council housing waiting lists are definitely growing. I'd like to put it to the panel, and this is my personal belief, I think there's a massive disconnect between local government that are working at the coalface trying to discharge their housing obligations and central government which is making these policies. There seems to be such a massive disconnect because local authorities are crying out for landlords at such an extent that they're now offering them what I call a golden hello, like a £3,000 incentive to bring a property into the sector for use. And then at a central government level, you've got all this extra legislation, Section 24, landlords are being deterred. And it just seems to me there's just this massive disconnect between local and central government, and that's just causing absolute chaos. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I'll start with this one because for my sins I happen to be a local councillor, and I can tell you that Vanessa hasn't even really begun to explain how big that disconnect is. It's not even a disconnect, it's those levers again pulling against each other. You've got local authorities on the ground crying out for housing. They have expensive campaigns that they run to try to get private landlords like us through their door. And then what happens? National government is doing everything they can to prevent that from happening. How do they expect it to work on any level? How does the national government expect it to work? How does local government expect it to work? I spend a lot of my time telling local governments, you can't work like this, because as long as you're doing your best on the ground, upstairs are doing all they can to stop it. It's a complete waste of everybody's time and energy. The funniest thing ever, it's not hilariously funny, but I found this funny, is a year or so back, I had a couple of phone calls. One phone call from my local authority, who I'm already on, begging me for housing, and then, hilariously, a representative from central government on the phone to me saying, we're trying to house 20 Syrian families in your area. This is getting desperate for us. Do you or any other landlords you know happen to have some houses we can have? Well, he went away from that phone call with a completely different perspective, I can tell you. Because there is no way on earth we are even able to do that, even if we wanted to. And then within those kind of circles, you've got local authorities who individually hate private landlords and want them stopped, and yet those local authorities will proudly tell you how they support their housing teams and their council authority staff in trying to find homes for people. So why is the executive of those councils in the council meeting saying, oh, we hate landlords, we want them all out of the way, they're terrible, they are, and yet their staff are sitting there going, no, we don't, we're desperate for them, we can't house people at the moment. It cannot possibly work, and frankly, they're not even trying to make it work. They are deliberately making it as difficult and contradictory as possible at every level of the process. So when they stand around and say, oh, we don't understand why private landlords won't work with us. Really? Just keep telling them until they get the message. That's what I would say.
I would say, David, that perhaps even more farcical is that you've got Croydon Council travelling around the UK trying to find private landlords, actually moving some tenants up to places like Blackpool, where the tenant has no support network. And then on the other hand, they've brought in selective licensing. So it seems even within the local authorities, there's there's, this friction going on.
Yeah, left-hand, right-hand is a major problem in both in central and local government. I was actually speaking at a conference of environmental health officers recently, and you tend to find environmental health officers and they are very frustrated with homelessness officers, because you frequently have situations where environmental health officers essentially make a property uninhabitable. They effectively prohibit its use, and then immediately the homelessness department will come along, rent the same property off the landlord, and now because it's being rented by the local authority, it's exempt from EHO interference, and they will immediately put people in it who are homeless. Now the difficulty is, of course, that the homelessness department take the view that it's better for someone to be in a bad property than street homeless, which is probably true up to a point, but you tend to find if you speak to people who have been taken off the streets, they would prefer to be in a property than street homeless, but they see that as a stepping stone towards actually a nice property, as opposed to being taken off the streets into another type of horror show, because naturally people are aspirational. Clearly, if I'm on the streets, I would rather have a roof over my head, but I would rather have a nice roof over my head, and once I've got to point A, I would like to get to point B. And I think there's a difficulty that the local authorities don't understand that trajectory, and you get this very ridiculous situation, which I often find myself hearing about, where people complain that benefits are being paid to private sector landlords for substandard property, and my normal response to that is, but you're paying it. You don't have to do that. You could simply have your environmental health department inspect all these properties and prohibit the ones that are inappropriate. And I think the other side problem that comes to this course is that central government keeps lumping more and more and more responsibilities onto local government. And the tenant fees bill will be the latest example of that next year, without any actual money to do the work. And the reality of the tenant fees bill, I suspect, is it won't be enforced, because local authorities won't have the funds to do the enforcement action, and trading standards officers have got a lot of better things on their plate, and things that they consider much more important, like alcohol that will make you go blind, or cigarettes that will kill you, or toys that will maim children. And they see that as a lot more important than enforcing against tenant fees, which will mean, of course, that good agents will just not charge tenant fees, bad agents will carry on charging tenant fees, nobody will enforce against them, and then, of course, at some point, I'll be called by a newspaper and asked to explain why agents are breaking the law, and I'll be told, my answer will be, well, because you're not enforcing it, what do you expect? So I always tend towards the position that, and this is the lawyer speaking now, is that if you pass laws that aren't enforced, then you haven't passed a law, and there was no point. If you give people rights that they can't enforce, then they don't have rights. And I suppose this is the slight area where Karen and I disagree. I support Karen's bill. I'm worried, however, that it won't do enough on the ground, because tenants still won't have enough opportunity to enforce rights against bad landlords, because the court system is underfunded, which, of course, most of you will experience from the other side of the coin when you can't evict a tenant who's not paying your rent. So the two things ultimately come together.
I'm going to have to say something on this, I'm afraid, because David says, right hand, left hand. I would say devil in the deep blue sea. And what we have got now is a catastrophic situation for some landlords, for the most vulnerable tenants, and indeed for the taxpayer, who's getting an absolutely rotten deal out of this, because in my borough alone, it's the sharp end borough, Westminster. The borough has paid £1 billion, £1 billion, since around 2010 on the costs of homelessness, which is insane. And we are in a situation where local government has taken around a 45% cut in central funding. It's the single biggest, along with the Ministry of Justice, cut in government funding of any government department. And so, yes, enforcement has taken a big hit in this, as so many other areas of government have. At the same time, both rough sleeping and family homelessness have risen dramatically, and social housing is continuing its sharp decline, a 95% drop in funding for social housing since 2010. So local authorities are trying to handle increased homelessness with a reduction in what families and individuals can pay for a private sector alternative, thanks to LHA and the benefit caps. And therefore, a borough like Croydon is having to try and find accommodation, in some cases hundreds of miles from London. Well, what else are they supposed to do? I think it is deplorable. I hate it. But to blame Croydon for this, or a local authority, is spectacularly missing the point. This is a conjunction of different circumstances. And I'll just end on one other thing that I think that exemplifies for me the sheer nightmare of the situation we are now in, which is a family who will be housed as a homeless household in a local authority, let's say mine, who will be in an ex-council property. The flat at number 1 will be paying, the tenants will be paying £150 a week for a secure tenancy. Next door, the local authority will be paying, it will be being paid through housing benefit, £500 a week for an ex-council flat under right to buy, which could be in any condition. And next door to that will be an ex-right to buy property in the private rented sector, where a putatively homeless household will be paying probably £400 a week for that same property. And those properties, all of them, could be in a catastrophically bad situation. But the truth of the matter is, it is most likely to be the private rented sector property. We know this is a fact. I think virtually every landlord who will be here at this show, who will have been at the RLA conference a few weeks ago, will not be those kind of landlords. That's the trouble. But it is those powerless individuals who are a pressure on local authorities that they have no ability to do anything about, who are trying to handle that, that unfortunate discrepancy between what they can do, what they're allowed to pay for, and what they're being expected to do.
We have touched on the lack of enforcement, and I have my own little theory on this. My belief is that, well, clearly, as Karen and David have touched on, it is a matter of resources within the local authority. But also, if you've got a rogue HMO with 16 people crammed in there, if that HMO is shut down, where are those 16 people going to go? And in some ways, I feel that the local authorities are between a rock and a hard place, because they don't actually have anywhere to put people that are shut down when a criminal landlord's property is shut down. So, Shiraz, do you have any view on the lack of enforcement? And surely there should be more enforcement of existing legislation before bringing in new legislation, which won't be enforced either.
Vanessa, before I answer that question, I'm just conscious there were quite a few hands up for questions. Do you want to take those now, or
at the end,
do those at the end?
Finish in a minute, yeah.
I just wanted to acknowledge that there were people wanting to ask. Sorry.
Me.
So there was a comment made about tenant fee ban, which is very interesting. So apart from the day job, I historically have been involved in a couple of online letting agents, and one of those is a business called Open Rent. Now, they as a business didn't charge any kind of admin fee for tenants that came through that platform. But the enforcement point I hadn't really thought about, I think is very interesting. So from April, I think it's the 1st or the 5th of April, all those fees are meant to be banned. I have first-hand example of an ex-tenant who was charged £500 admin fee to move into a property by an agent. The agent was managing that property on behalf of a landlord, and the agent didn't even ask for a landlord reference from me. And it's that kind of behaviour, I think, that has meant that carpet action, blanket action has been taken across the entire sector. So my personal view on it is that if you are going to enforce, if you're going to introduce a law, you have to enforce. Personally, I wouldn't have introduced a blanket ban. I think all businesses inherently have a cost base, and they should be allowed to cover that cost base. And I probably would have, my decision, I probably would have put a cap on it. But typically, I would say, from a very small sample size, it's those agents that charged ridiculous fees that are those agents that probably work with landlords that are probably renting out properties that they shouldn't really be renting out. So ultimately, you end up in this situation whereby if you don't enforce, people are going to think they can get away with it. And it won't just stop at the letting fee ban, it will continue into other parts of enforcement as well. And local councils are not being equipped to handle what they've been asked to do. So my local council is Waltham Forest. It has licensing in place, Personally, as a landlord, I have no issue with licensing being in place as long as it's enforced, right? Because the whole point is you want to understand where your money is going. So you want transparency. I'm not sure I've ever received that from the council. And you want them to actually take action against landlords that abuse their position. And I think the council has taken action against 2, I think, from memory. And the licensing has been in place for close to 3 years now. So if you're going to want them to do stuff, then you actually have to give them the funding to make sure it happens.
Definitely. Okay, well, we've got just 5 minutes left now. There were some hands up. Is there anybody that wants to make a point or ask a question? Lady in green.
Hiya, I'm a bit shy, sorry. I would like to know your opinion on mortgage interest coming up. I won't be able to take that off my tax bill in about 3 years, and I'm quite worried, and I may have to make 33 people homeless.
You're not alone there. Good question. Any views on Section 24?
Oh, yes.
We could have a whole debate about that.
Said the tenant tax campaigner. What a surprise. Well, look, okay, the haters will tell us that we don't deserve that as a relief, that we've caused all sorts of problems for tenants, that somehow we are being benefited by it. But actually, the whole of the tenant tax campaign was predicated on 2 things, 2 very obvious things, in my opinion. That if you start adding significant extra tax costs into the supply chain, and bear in mind this could be as much as 100% of your income, you can even pay tax on a loss now. If you are going to do that, there are only 2 possible outcomes. Either those people who are less affected will raise rents to try to cover the extra, or those people who are very badly affected will simply have to leave the market. They'll sell their house, that tenant will become homeless. And it is quite clear to me, totally clear to me, really to anyone, I think, with a brain cell, that if you do that, they will be the inevitable consequences. Now, Ireland tried this twice and have had to backpedal incredibly quickly because all of our predictions for Britain came true. Rents rose, homelessness rocketed. Ireland have now got a homeless problem that they say they will never, ever be able to solve now because of that issue. It is beginning to happen here. The early trajectories in homelessness in the first 2 years since this was announced are following the same patterns as Ireland, where homelessness is rising significantly across the country. That will only get worse. Therefore, I say we should stop the tax attacks on landlords. We should be able to maintain what is a legitimate cost of our business as an expense. Any other business would do the same. It's ludicrous to think we can operate without it. So stop messing about with it, because it is only causing further problems.
Yeah, I think there's a number of really strange issues around the Section 24 change. I mean, it's clearly not fully thought through. And the thing that I think so odd about it is, if you're short-letting, you can get out of it. So the government is presumably then encouraging short-letting, which other parts of the government think are a bad idea. And certainly local authorities think are a bad idea. So it's a bit of a weird inconsistency there. If you incorporate, you can get out of it. And in fact, there's some evidence that incorporations, particularly in London, have gone up by 10%. That's not actually terribly good for enforcement. It's way harder to enforce against limited companies. And of course, they never pay the fines. They just go bankrupt anyway. So there's a real disconnect in thinking. I think the thing that really worries me about this situation is January 2019. Because the reality is, and you have to think outside this room, most people don't know anything about Section 24. You all do. Most people out there, whether landlords or not, and most landlords know nothing about it. And in January 2019, they've got to fill in a tax return for the 17-18 tax year, which is the first year that they've lost their mortgage interest relief. And a lot of them are going to get a horrible shock. At which point, of course, they're already into the second year. So in fact, they've still got an even worse shock coming, which they will at this point find out about. And I really think there's a real risk at this point of either major implosions or divestment. Now, there is a more interesting scenario here is also, and what's not clear, is how many landlords are actually affected. Not all landlords have mortgages. A substantial percentage, in fact, don't. So they're not affected by it. So there is a sort of weird problem here. And then, of course, you get to quite an interesting sort of discussion about why would you go after mortgage financing for properties? Is the government therefore think that all landlords should just buy property with money they have in their back pocket. It's not so it's not fully thought through. I still see it, I'm afraid, as a very simple thing, which is a mechanism of diverting revenue out of landlords' pockets into the treasuries. I would endorse what's been said about Ireland. I think it was very notable that Ireland had started a process of reversing it, and then suddenly, just a couple of months ago, decided to do it 2 years early. And I suspect this government will end up at some point doing the same thing.
Okay, well, we're just coming to a close here now. I'm sorry, I'm being told to wind it up, I'm afraid. One more question? Okay.
Thank you for that. I just want to know if there's a silver light at the cloud from the Labour Party. I remember the 1970s when slogans were going around saying, why pay rent? Thousands of people were not paying rent. People were unable to be evicted from flats and things that they own because the government created sit-in tenants and God knows what, which was a Labour government, if I remember. But I want to know if given the problems that have been expressed here, are there any of those problems going to be sympathetically addressed by the Labour government should they get in?
To which I would say there is quite a detailed strategy for the private rented sector for the Labour Party, which is on the Labour Party website, which I'm very happy to tell you. Some of it I know you would hate. I mean, I think that's absolutely, I understand not everything is going to be welcomed by landlords, and particularly in relation to Section 21, but I do hope that we are able to have a progressive, a positive dialogue with landlords around as many of these issues as we possibly can. I can't answer about the tax issue because it is generally the case that tax policies for governments are, for opposition parties are formulated, you know, when we get close to an election, and a balance always has to be struck between the competing pressures for tax income and for tax breaks. I think David is right about some of the sort of rather perverse elements of this that I think need to be looked at, and I would certainly want to do that. I'm very happy for us to have that dialogue, and I think certainly in terms of issues around enforcement and standards, that it is people in this room are part of the solution and part of that conversation, because nobody has an interest as a good landlord in being tarred with the brush of that minority of very poor landlords. And I hope we could all agree on that and find a way of a constructive agreement on that.
Okay, so we're just coming to the end now, guys. Just one line each from you. What can all of us here today, what can we do to improve the situation for landlords in the private rented sector? Where is that common ground? Where can we work together? Is it a case of lobbying our MPs? Is it a case of joining a landlord association, which I actually say everybody should join at least 2 landlord associations because they offer different things, different flavours. What can we do as a community here today, all people that care about the private rented sector, care about higher standards, care about our tenants, what can we do going forwards?
Not sure we can sum that up in one line, but you've covered most of it. I think, how could I summarise this? Keep doing your jobs. Keep doing your jobs as well as you can. Take pride in what you do and tell everyone. When you get a chance to be on a forum, when you get a chance to speak to your MP or anybody else at the council, anyone that can influence our lives and our tenants' lives, tell them what you do, make them understand, and don't give up.
Well, obviously everyone should join a landlord association, that goes without saying, and clearly a particular one. The thing I would say so much is please write to your MP. Please visit your MP in a workshop and explain to them what you do and explain to them why the problems you have with current policy. Not enough people do it. Most MPs think I'm a filthy lobbyist, which is because I am, and they don't take me, and they take what I say seriously up to a point, but the majority of MPs are much more persuaded by people who are on the ground doing it and encountering problems than they are by me berating them on a daily basis. And in fact, the RLA's experience is every time somebody goes to see their MP with some of our material, we tend to get a meeting with that MP afterwards. And it's hugely important. And it doesn't matter what party they are. I'm an equal opportunities lobbyist. So it's not done enough. People expect landlords associations to sort it out for them. We can up to a point, but it actually needs you to go and tell your MP that there is an issue.
For me, it's simple, which is that if people think your vote counts, they will probably listen to you. And if you don't go out and make your voice heard, they'll just assume that actually they've either got you on side or you're not causing them, you're not being a pain in the arse. So I would engage and pester until you ultimately get some action. And I think that's probably the best action.
Anything to add from Karen?
I just say we all have an interest in a healthy, safe, good quality private rented sector. That's what we want to see. Do not let yourselves be dragged down by the minority who bring the whole sector into disrepute, and they are there. By all means, engage with local politicians in your local authority and with MPs. Be aware that there are conflicting pressures in all of this, some of which we've discussed in the last hour, and it would be very, very good for you also to be part in understanding that. Some of the pressures that local authorities are under, particularly with balancing their obligations to people in housing need with the regulation and enforcement in the private rented sector. So, let us engage with you as well as you engaging with us about the things you're concerned about.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Hope you've enjoyed this debate. We've only really scratched the surface, really. There's so much to talk about. Thank you all for coming, and thank you very much to our fantastic panellists for joining us here today. And I hope you enjoyed the conversation. A lot more to come. Thank you.